It's Friday, the 24th of February, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be talking to our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran here in Westminster, and in a big week in Scottish politics, I'll be joined by Jenny Davidson in Holyrood. On the programme, 1 year after the Russian invasion, two former prime ministers say we should send fighter jets to Ukraine.
It's admirable that we're proposing to train Ukrainian fighters to fly NATO fast jets. Let's cut to the chase and give them the planes too.
We need to do all we can as fast as we can. My view is that does include fighter jets.
Rishi Sunak is trying to strike a new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, but Keir Starmer says he's been blocked by his own MPs.
It's the same old story. The country has to wait while he plucks up the courage to take on the malcontents, the reckless, the wreckers on his own benches.
But the Prime Minister says a Labour government would give the EU too much.
It's his usual position when it comes to the European Union. It's give the EU a blank cheque and agree to anything they offer. It's not a strategy, Mr. Speaker, that's surrender.
In Scotland, the SNP leadership race is debated at First Minister's questions.
Now Humza Yousaf is the worst health secretary since devolution, but it looks like he's going to fail upwards.
Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared of Humza Yousaf.
And England's chief medical officer takes aim at tobacco companies.
The cigarette industry goes to the most vulnerable teenagers, and it aims to addict them at that stage of their lives. And then, when they find they can't come off, they're hooked.
Let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, as we saw in the headlines, two former Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, both saying in the Commons this week that it's time to send fighter jets to Ukraine.
Yes. So today, of course, is the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. At the start of this week, when MPs returned from a half-term break, they held a debate on Ukraine. So it was noticeable for lots of things, really. But obviously, the thing that really got everybody's attention was the fact that we got not just one, but two former Prime Ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, both really agreeing with one another and putting pressure on Rishi Sunak. You remember before MPs went off for their break, they heard from President Zelensky in Westminster Hall, and he was calling for modern fighter jets and managed to get quite a lot of applause from all of the MPs and peers who'd assembled to listen to him. And what we heard at the start of this week was both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss sort of echoing that call in this debate. There wasn't a vote at the end, so there wasn't anybody forcing anyone to make a decision. But of course, it does increase that pressure on Rishi Sunak to do something and to respond to that call.
This week, the war that President Putin expected to last just 3 days reaches a year in duration. Russian forces have killed thousands of Ukrainians. 18 million Ukrainians have left their homes. Thousands have been forcibly deported to Russia. Historic cities now lie in ruins. Early last year in New York, I predicted that if Putin were foolish enough to invade Ukraine, that Ukrainians would defend their homeland ferociously, and I've been vindicated in that prediction. Today, they are more unified, more proud, more determined than ever. And as President Zelensky said when he addressed my honourable and right honourable friends and those across the House here in Westminster Hall on the 8th of February, freedom will win.
Britain stands united behind Ukraine. And in that spirit, I want to pay tribute to the Foreign Secretary and to the Defence Secretary and to our two former Prime Ministers who deserve credit for the roles that they have played. On Britain's military help to Ukraine and on reinforcing NATO allies, the government has had and will continue to have Labour's fullest support. If Ukraine is going to prevail over what Putin will throw at it, the UK and our allies should set aside individual announcements and instead lay out a long-term strategy to provide the support that Ukraine needs, whether it be ammunition, additional air defence capabilities, or NATO standard weaponry.
It is a fine thing that we finally promised tanks, but there is no conceivable ground for delay in getting them to Ukraine. We need those machines, Abrahams, Challengers, Leopards, to make a real difference in real time in the next few weeks, not next year. It's admirable that we're proposing to train Ukrainian fighters to fly NATO fast jets. I hear the caution of my honourable friend. But it's curious that we're doing this before we've even taken the decision in principle to give them the planes. Let's cut to the chase and give them the planes too.
We need to do all we can to make sure Ukraine wins this war as soon as possible. Every extra day, lives lost, women violated, towns destroyed. We need to do all we can as fast as we can. My view is that does include fighter jets. And we've had a discussion today about which are the best possible options. Having spoken to the Ukrainians about this months and months ago, I know what they want is an option. They want, so let's work with our allies to get them an option to be able to use, because otherwise they won't be able to prevail.
We've got to leapfrog out of this bad habit that we've gotten into, that first we say no and then we say yes. And there is this extended time period between the saying no and then the saying yes. So on air defence, we said no to Patriot missiles until it was that we said yes. On tanks, we said no until months and months later we said yes. Now, can we please just short-circuit the process of sending in the F-16s as fast as possible with trained pilots?
I am pleased up to a certain extent that the United Kingdom is training combat air pilots for Ukraine, but I am left wondering to what end? And I am also wondering what is happening to the combat air pilots in training with the Royal Air Force, some of whom, I'm not making this up, Mr Deputy Speaker, some of whom are having to wait 8 or even 9 years to become qualified. So what is the knock-on effect of training Ukraine's combat air pilots? That's not to say that it's not the right thing to do, but every action has an equal but opposite reaction, and we should see the whole picture before we celebrate, perhaps prematurely.
Sean, let's move on to Prime Minister's questions, because Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was very keen to question the Prime Minister about his attempts to improve the Brexit deal in Northern Ireland. What happened?
Yes, so Sir Keir Starmer devoted all of his questions to this issue. Now, of course, he did have questions about what Rishi Sunak was looking to get out of this deal, but also there was a bit of a familiar theme. We've seen week after week that Keir Starmer is very keen to portray Rishi Sunak as somehow a kind of a prisoner of elements of the Conservative Party who are restricting his ability to come up with policies and to move. And he likes to portray Rishi Sunak as someone who's kind of pushed around a bit by some of the different factions of the Conservative Party. And he managed to weave the two issues together with his attack on Wednesday.
Mr Speaker, the Labour Party is proud to be the party of the Good Friday Agreement and peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. We welcome attempts to make the protocol work more effectively. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it has been poorly implemented and that the basis for any deal must be removing unnecessary checks on goods?
As he knows, we are still in active discussions with the European Union, but he should know that I am a Conservative, a Brexiter and a Unionist, and any agreement that we reach needs to tick all three boxes. It needs to ensure sovereignty for Northern Ireland. It needs to safeguard Northern Ireland's place in our union, and it needs to find practical solutions to the problems faced by people and businesses. I will be resolute in fighting for what is best for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that the protocol can be improved, but there are trade-offs and we need to face up to them. His predecessor told businesses that there would be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. That was absolute nonsense and it destroyed trust. So in the interests of restoring that trust, will he confirm that to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, the deal he's negotiating is going to see Northern Ireland continue to follow some EU law?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the honourable gentleman is jumping ahead. We are still in intensive discussions with the European Union to ensure that we can find agreement that meets the test that I set, and that is sovereignty for Northern Ireland. It's Northern Ireland's place in our precious union, and it is to find practical solutions to the problems faced by people and businesses. I have spent time engaging and listening to those communities in Northern Ireland, businesses and political parties. I have a good understanding of what is required, and I will keep fighting until we get it.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is biting his tongue, but at some point the irreconcilables on his benches are going to twig and they're going to come after him. The former Trade Minister says there can be no role for the European Court of Justice in Northern Ireland. So will the Prime Minister be honest with them and tell them that's not going to happen?
For the honourable gentleman to be talking about a deal that he hasn't even seen, that we are still negotiating, that isn't finalised, and it's his usual position when it comes to the European Union. It's give the EU a blank cheque and agree to anything they offer. It's not a strategy, Mr. Speaker. That's surrender.
It's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the 30th anniversary of the Downing Street Declaration. Tony Blair and John Major both recognised that politics in Northern Ireland is built on trust and not telling people what they want to hear, and the need to take seriously the concerns of both communities, nationalists and unionists. It's vital their voices are heard. So can the Prime Minister confirm that whatever deal he brings back, this House will get a vote on it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Parliament will express its view. But what is crucial? What is crucial here? But what is crucial here is that this is not about his desire to play political games in this House with this situation. This is about what is best for the people and communities of Northern Ireland. And that, Mr. Speaker, is what I will keep fighting for.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I take it from that this House will get a vote, and I look forward to that vote in due course. Because everyone knows the basis of this deal has been agreed for weeks, but it's the same old story. The country has to wait while he plucks up the courage to take on the malcontents, the reckless, the wreckers on his own benches. But I'm here to tell him he doesn't need to worry about that, because we will put country before party and ensure that Labour votes to get it through. He should accept our offer, ignore the howls of indignation from those on his side who will never take yes for an answer. Why doesn't he just get on with it?
Mr. Speaker, what I am doing is talking and listening to the people of Northern Ireland. That is the right thing to do. It's to make sure that we can respond and resolve to the concerns of the unionist communities and businesses in Northern Ireland, and that is what I will keep doing. But, Mr. Speaker, we know, but the honourable gentleman talks about his plans. We have heard that tomorrow he's going to announce 5 missions. But we already know what they are. It's uncontrolled immigration, it's reckless spending, it's higher debt, and it's softer sentences. And for the fifth pledge, Mr. Speaker, we all know it's that he reserves the right to change his mind on the other 4.
Sean, of course, the big political reality of this row over a future agreement with Northern Ireland is that actually there isn't a functioning government there at the moment because the Democratic Unionist Party, the biggest unionist group, pulled out of the power-sharing agreement some time ago over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And at PMQs, we heard from their leader.
Yes, and this was an important intervention because although the talk at Westminster for several days now is that some sort of deal is imminent, as we heard there, Rishi Sunak wasn't giving away any details. He was basically saying to people, look, you're asking me about a deal that hasn't been agreed, and he was brushing those kind of questions off. But everybody knows that the tensions that he faces are that he needs to satisfy some of the Eurosceptics in his own party, and he has sort of set himself this target of basically satisfying the DUP and meeting their requirements from any deal. Now, it's quite clear that when Sir Geoffrey Donaldson stood up, he would like the existing arrangements, the existing rules, to be completely rewritten.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his efforts in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It is unacceptable that Northern Ireland has been put in this place with a protocol imposed upon us that harms our place in the United Kingdom. It must be replaced with arrangements that are acceptable and restore our place in the United Kingdom and its internal market. Does the Prime Minister accept how important the constitutional and democratic issues are in relation to getting a solution? And will he agree with me that it is unacceptable that EU laws are imposed on Northern Ireland with no democratic scrutiny or consent? And will he assure me that he will address these fundamental constitutional issues and do so not just by tweaking the protocol, but by rewriting the legally binding treaty text?
Prime Minister. Can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question, but also thank him for the role that he has played in recent months in articulating unionist concerns. I have heard loud and clear when he says he wants and needs these issues resolved so that he has a basis to work with others to restore power sharing, and I know that that is genuine. He raised a question of practical issues, and it is vital that these are addressed. But he also raises, Mr. Speaker, a vital question about the constitutional and legal framework in which these arrangements exist. And I can assure him that I agree. Addressing the democratic deficit is an essential part of the negotiations that remain ongoing with the European Union. And just as he has been consistent, so have I. And I can assure him that this is at the very heart of the issues that must be addressed.
Sean, thank you for now. Let's go to Holyrood and speak to our Scotland political reporter there, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, the big story, of course, jaw-dropping, in fact, when she announced it, Nicola Sturgeon, is that she is going to be stepping down, and the race has started to replace her to become the new leader of the SNP. And we saw that the issue came up in First Minister's questions.
That's right. This was Nicola Sturgeon's first FMQ since that shock announcement last week that she was resigning. But amazing how quickly things move on. Everything's turned now to who her successor will be. There's 3 people in the running: Finance Secretary Kate Forbes, Health Secretary Humza Yousaf, and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan. They've all launched their campaigns this week. Now, initially, in this first week of the campaign, a lot of attention has been focused on Kate Forbes' Christian beliefs, particularly around same-sex marriage. But that did change a bit at First Minister's questions, with both the Conservatives and Labour going on health issues, particularly on the back of an Audit Scotland report that was published yesterday, critiquing the Scottish Government's plans for NHS recovery post-COVID. The Conservatives in particular using that to attack Humza Yousaf's record as Health Secretary.
8 years ago, a failed SNP Health Secretary became First Minister. Now, history looks like it's repeating itself. Why would anybody risk Scotland's future by giving a man with Humza Yousaf's record more power? So let's just look at his time in office while the First Minister gets more intel from the Deputy First Minister. I don't know what's coming there. So let's look at what Humza Yousaf has done in office. He was Transport Minister who drove without a licence. He delayed the dualling of the A9, and he clapped like a seal when Nicola Sturgeon launched a ferry with painted-on windows. He was Justice Secretary who did nothing while violent crime rose, got duped by a hoax video into calling on the police to investigate Rangers players, and damaged free speech with his Hate Crime Act. And now Humza Yousaf is the worst Health Secretary since devolution, but it looks like he's going to fail upwards. In any other line of work, Humza Yousaf would have been sacked, not promoted. Forget being SNP leader. Why is he even still in government?
First Minister. Well, I don't know about anybody else, Presiding Officer, but Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared of Humza Yousaf. As I am sure he will be scared of whoever is elected to succeed me as SNP leader. But let me just reflect on this fact. In the 8 years that I have been First Minister, the people of Scotland have had no fewer than 8 opportunities to cast a verdict on me, my party and my government. And in every single one of these 8 opportunities, the people of Scotland have rejected the Conservatives and put their trust in me, my party and my government.
Now, the SNP leadership race is due to run until the 27th of March, so it's likely that Nicola Sturgeon's going to face a few more weeks of questioning at FMQs yet.
Oh yes, I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. Jenny, as we've been covering on the programme, there's been an ongoing row about what happens to transgender prisoners in Scotland. The Criminal Justice Committee in Holyrood has been looking into that this week. What happened?
That's right. Well, this relates particularly to that case we've mentioned a few times now of Isla Bryson, a transgender rapist who was initially placed into a women's prison before being moved into a male prison. There was a rapid review of that particular case within the Scottish Prison Service, and this week Justice Secretary Keith Brown and Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service Theresa Medhurst were in front of the Criminal Justice Committee to give evidence on that. Now, the 2 key questions the committee were really looking for answers to were who made that decision to move Isla Bryson from a female prison into a male prison, and what was the reason for placing her in a female prison in the first place as a rapist. Now, the committee, some tetchiness, I think it's fair to say, around the questioning and the answers they were getting. They did get a clear answer that it was the Scottish Prison Service that made decisions. It was an operational matter, not a decision by the government. Perhaps less clear what the basis for the decisions were.
Were you effectively overruled by Scottish ministers on the decision that you ultimately were in charge of?
No, absolutely not.
At what point did it ever feel or be deemed appropriate to house someone who had been convicted of the crime of rape, to house them at any stage in this proceedings in the women's prison estate? Why in anyone's logical thinking would that ever be appropriate?
So, I understand the public concerns, and I understand why you've raised that question. There are a really complex set of issues that are required to be considered, both in relation to the risks that someone may pose, the risks to themselves, the needs of individuals, the needs of others, and the rights of individuals and the rights of others. So it's not a simple process.
Now, that was a rapid case review of just one particular case. There's also a broader review of the wider Scottish Prison Service policy around handling of transgender prisoners. Theresa Medhurst was asked when we can expect that. She couldn't give a direct answer, a specific date. She said it would be this year, and she hoped it would be sooner rather than later.
Jenny, finally, the Scottish budget for next year was passed by MSPs. How did that go?
Well, a bit less dramatic at this stage, obviously, because we already knew what was in it and the tax plans had been passed separately. But John Swinney, Acting Finance Secretary, did have 3 new announcements for this final stage of the budget. One was an extra £100 million for councils. That's as a result of some extra funding that's coming from the UK government. He said that would take the total real terms increase in funding for councils compared to last year's budget to a 3% increase. He also committed to fully fund inter-island ferry services, which have been under pressure due to inflation, due to the rising cost of fuel. And the third was a reversal of a cut to funding for Creative Scotland, which funds the arts and culture in Scotland, so an extra £6.6 million for them.
I am committing to provide local government with an additional £100 million to support local authorities and their expenditure. This funding is designed to assist councils in making a meaningful 2023-24 pay offer for non-teaching staff, recognising the critical role that those staff play in delivering frontline services. I hope this will enable a swift agreement in the Scottish Joint Council pay negotiations so that relevant staff receive a pay increase as early as possible.
I think Mr Swinney was right when he expressed his frustrations at the difficulties forced upon him by the UK mini-budget last September, accompanying all the other difficulties. He described that, if I recall, as the height of incompetency. But can I take him much closer to home when he declares that this budget predicament has been caused by Westminster? Because that is just not true. Yes, this budget was going to be difficult and tough, but many of the current budgetary problems that have been made right here in Scotland by a government that has, for months, if not years, been well out of touch with public opinion when it comes to the economy.
This last week has not just been a long-time politics. It makes this budget decision faintly ridiculous, because this is not a budget that will last. I don't see any of the leadership candidates, once elected, leaving the budget well alone. It will last as long as the next summer budget revision, because we already have leadership candidates saying what they would do differently.
Now, that takes us back really to where we started. As Daniel Johnson said, there's going to be a new First Minister soon. They won't be able to change the tax plans now they're set. They won't be able to change the overall amount available, but they're likely to have their own plans for how the money should be spent.
Jenny Davidson, thank you. Jenny there at Holyrood. Let's return to events here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, that key piece of government legislation at the moment, it's the strikes bill that the government is trying to get on the statute book. It would mean that some key workers on the railways and in emergency services would have to keep or run a minimum level of service even when they're on strike. The bill was debated in the House of Lords this week. What happened to it there?
Yes, well, this is a hugely controversial piece of legislation. It's already been through the Commons. We heard there that Labour were describing it as a sack workers bill, and that's because, as you say, this is a bill that would say in the future that employers could come along to their staff and say, look, these are the people we are going to need to work when there's industrial action. And in those circumstances, if you've been told you'll have to work and you then go on strike, then the possibility is there that you could then be sacked. So it's very controversial. It came to the House of Lords this week. It was the first opportunity peers had had to discuss the bill. And we saw that certainly on the opposition benches, there was a lot of unhappiness and a signal that there's probably going to be opposition to these proposals later on.
This bill aims to maintain a reasonable balance between the ability of workers to strike with the rights and freedoms of the public to access those essential services during those strikes. Industrial action is disruptive for everyone. For those who rely on those essential services to get to work or care for their family, and for the NHS trying to get the backlog down, or schools trying to recover some of the lost learning after the pandemic. It, of course, also vitally impacts our local businesses whose sales and productivity suffer.
What we do know for sure is that the government's evidence base for this bill is deeply flawed. Countries which ministers commonly cite as comparators do not, in fact, impose minimum service levels by state diktat, nor do they give free rein to sack striking workers who refuse an order to work. Taking powers to strip nurses, teachers, firefighters, transport workers and others of their livelihoods when they strike for better pay and conditions is not generally regarded as a feature of a free society. Yeah. Has the noble Lord the Minister considered the real-world consequences of this bill? It would poison relations between employers and unions by rigging the balance of power still further against working people and by seeking to frustrate the effective expression of legitimate grievances.
To hear this government, of all people, ask for support for regulation on the basis of aligning with EU countries tells us either they completely lack a sense of irony or that they actually want us to laugh at them. Now, my lords, the overriding priority for any government faced with this situation should be to work at making these professions more attractive. And that does mean looking at pay, but also at the morale of the profession. And what we're seeing from this government is the opposite of that. They set out to give the impression that they are immovable on pay, that they have few ideas on staffing levels, and as icing on that hard cake, they come up with this bill as a warning to anyone who dares to challenge them.
When I leave home and come here during the week, I leave behind carers in charge of somebody I love very much. And the last time there was an ambulance strike, I basically said as I went through the door, "Don't take him out for a walk today." Now, that was because I didn't want to put that additional risk into his life. But that is how people out there, whatever their admiration, and there is a great deal of admiration for all of those who work in our essential services field, that is the mindset of what is starting to creep in to the minds of people who have responsibility for others. And it is, I hope, to relieve that mindset that my noble friend feels that there have to be minimum service levels that not only the government, but which the rest of us who do care for vulnerable people or who may have accidents or things that happen to us during the course of a strike, that we can rely on. There is a creeping fear in this country of what may happen to me or my loved ones.
It's no great secret that the Labour Party hopes soon to be back into power. So let me offer a thought. Just imagine that world of Labour back in power. I find it very difficult, but let's just imagine that. We're told that the Labour government will repeal this legislation. But I have no doubt that this legislation will survive. No future government is going to lay itself open to the accusation that they are anti-patient, anti-commuter, anti-student and anti-the ordinary worker. No Labour government will risk the accusation that they sold the public interest out to any paymaster. No, I think that they will do a Blair and move on.
So peers debating the strikes bill there. What's actually going to happen to this legislation now, Sean?
So that was their very first debate. So at the end of that debate, the bill was given what's known as a second reading, and that means it's cleared the first hurdle in the House of Lords. So we heard there support, obviously, from Conservatives, and it is a government measure, but there was concern from the opposition. Now, that's kind of more important in the House of Lords because the parliamentary arithmetic in the House of Lords is different, and so the government doesn't have a majority. And those concerns, and some other concerns that came out during that debate about some of the sort of more technical aspects of the bill and the idea about, well, does this change people's employment rights, and does it give too much power to ministers and not enough parliamentary scrutiny? So all of these kind of issues, they will be debated now at some length, because the next stage of the process is what they call the committee stage, and that's when the bill in the House of Lords is discussed line by line. They go through every single clause and line, and people will propose changes. And then a little bit later, the next stage, the crucial stage, is when they start to have votes on those changes. And in the past, and indeed in recent weeks, we have seen the government lose votes on its legislation when the House of Lords can agree on a position and force through a change.
So it could all take some time yet.
It could take some time yet. It won't address any of the industrial disputes that we've seen going on now. No. And the government has always said it wasn't meant to be a solution for what's happening right now, but it could take some time. And of course, if the Lords do make changes, we could then have a standoff between the government in the House of Commons, where it has a majority, and members of the House of Lords who think they could force through a change.
Let's turn to the Health Committee in the Commons. It's been looking at how to prevent people becoming ill. We heard Professor Chris Whitty in the headlines, the Chief Medical Officer for England, giving evidence, and he was pretty strong in his language when it came to the issue of smoking.
He was. I mean, this in a way, I suppose, is a more traditional visit to Westminster for Chris Whitty. He has this kind of dual role. He's both the UK government's chief medical advisor and, as you say, he's the chief medical officer for England. And I suppose he was doing with this what chief medical officers traditionally have done. But, of course, we don't see him in that role because, of course, he was on our screens every night during the pandemic. And he was talking about prevention. And he had criticism for quite a lot of people, actually. He talked about junk food as he sees it and the measures that can be taken there. But as you say, he really took aim at the tobacco companies and he had some pretty stringent criticism of them.
Lung cancer is our #1 killer of a cancer. It's a horrible way to die. Most people who are diagnosed die within a year, very unpleasantly. 79% of all lung cancers are preventable. The great majority of that is caused by smoking. And then there are also some additional issues in terms of industrial processes and some issues in terms of air pollution as well. But the big one really is smoking. If smoking disappeared, the great majority of the worst of our cancers would just disappear. A great majority of people who smoke will have taken up smoking before they are 18, and almost all of them will have taken up smoking before they're 20, i.e. the cigarette industry goes to the most vulnerable teenagers, and it aims to addict them at that stage of their lives, and then when they find they can't come off, they're hooked. Most people who smoke don't want to smoke. This is framed by the cigarette industry as an issue of choice. Actually, they have deliberately taken the most vulnerable children and people in society and taken their choice away from them by addicting them at an early stage of their life.
You said that many areas of public health had, quotes, either trodden water or gone backwards since the beginning of the pandemic. And you were referring specifically, I think, to smoking, obesity, alcoholism as growing public health issues. You called for a long-term and local approach to prevention. So the Secretary of State seems to agree with you that prevention is central to his mission. I wonder whether you think it is central to his mission and to this government's mission.
If Parliament chooses to enact some of the things it could do, we could improve things like air pollution, reduce things like smoking, and reduce the risks of obesity in the most vulnerable. So those are political choices.
But it's self-evident that those choices are not being made to the extent that you would like.
Correct.
Professor Chris Whitty there talking to Steve Brine. Finally, let's talk about football, because the government has been discussing plans to set up a new regulator, and there's been quite a lot of discussion about it. This is for the game in England. What's the background?
So, ages ago now, it seems, there was this fan-led review of football. It was led by a Conservative former sports minister, Tracy Crouch. And for quite a long time, people would be asking the government, well, when are you going to come forward with your proposals? You've had this review. What exactly are you going to do? And so this football white paper, as it's known in the parliamentary jargon, is long awaited. There were questions at the start of the week about when are these proposals going to come through. So then on Thursday, the government did publish its proposals, and it was really selling them as being a massive overhaul of the game, describing it as probably the biggest change since the rules for football were agreed. So they've really put it forward. But it does involve quite a lot of big changes. It's designed to protect some clubs. It's designed to give fans a voice. But as you say, it introduces this new idea of a regulator.
Our national game has become a worldwide sport, loved and followed by millions. The growth of the Premier League, English football's top division, is an achievement to be celebrated, and our grassroots game is a force for good in bringing people and communities together across the country. However, the findings of the fan-led review made clear that the underlying financial and governance structures that support English football are unstable and fragile. The review highlighted the perverse financial incentives that encourage clubs to overspend in chasing success. We will publish a football governance white paper this week. This will set out a clear and well thought through package of reforms that will ensure the foundations of the game are strong and the game can continue to thrive.
Fans are desperate for a proper say and for assurances about ownership and sustainability of these global and local assets. Yet without a regulator, these assurances can't be made. So will the government take responsibility for the clubs that go bust, spiral into decline, or which are bought by unsuitable new owners in the years they've wasted bringing the regulator in? As we will see again today, Mr Speaker, Parliament fully supports these proposals. Labour is fully committed to them. The Minister is facing an open goal. So instead of constantly passing it back, can he just put the ball into the back of the net?
I make no apology for taking time to make sure that the white paper that we are going to publish this week actually addresses what are essentially quite complex and sometimes difficult issues.
My right honourable friend the Minister is aware that there is a huge degree of unanimity across the House about the need for urgent reform with the many crises we know that have affected clubs at the top of the game and further down the pyramid as well, which just continue. And I'm pleased on that basis to hear that we are going to see the white paper later this week. But he will be aware that that is only one step in the process, that actually the white paper will need to be followed by legislation before we see a regulator or any of the other reforms that we want to see. So can my right honourable friend tell me, is it the government's intention to legislate in this session? And if not, is it the government's intention to legislate in this Parliament to introduce these much-needed reforms?
Well, I am grateful to my right honourable friend, and he is right to highlight the importance of this issue. And as I say, we will be setting out our plans for reform of the game in this forthcoming white paper. And with all government policy, when government commits to reform, legislation only follows when parliamentary time allows. And of course, that is something that we'll be working at pace on.
We are on our way to Wembley. And I'm sure the Minister will join me in wishing every success to Newcastle United in the League Cup final on Sunday. But he must know that even that success will not erase the years of anger and frustration at unsuitable, unaccountable, and sometimes downright dodgy ownership within a Premier League which is out of touch and doesn't seem to care about fans. Fans should be at the heart of football. This government is just messing with the heart and soul of fans. So will he commit now? It's the final question. Will he commit now that the white paper will institute an independent regulator, that fans will have real power in the beautiful game, and that this will be in place for the start of the next season?
I'm looking forward to attending that match at the weekend. I am already got a list as long as my arm of people who want to join me at that match. I can assure her that throughout all of this, I have tried my best to ensure that the voices of fans are heard in the published white paper this week.
Before we go, Sean, what are we expecting in Parliament next week?
Well, a lot of the interest, I think, at the start of the week will be on the House of Lords, because they are going to debate a bill and it's going to go through all of its parliamentary stages very quickly, and that is the Northern Ireland Executive Bill. And this is a proposal to basically push back the date when new elections might have to take place for the Northern Ireland Assembly. And so that was all a bill that was rushed through the Commons this week, and it's going to the Lords next week.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's all we have time for Politics UK. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.